The American test pilot stopped mid-sentence when he saw it turn. His hands, still gripping the edge of the briefing table, went white at the knuckles. He looked at the camera recording his debriefing like he was confessing to a crime he didn't commit. The words came out slow, careful, almost apologetic. The plane had just performed a maneuver that shouldn't exist. Not according to the physics they knew, not according to anything they'd seen in 4 years of war. And now, 3 weeks after Japan surrendered, someone had to explain what they'd found hidden in a cave on Kyushu Island. August 1945. The war was over, but the questions were just beginning. Deep in the mountains of southern Japan, occupation forces discovered something that made even the hardened intelligence officers go quiet. It was a prototype, sleek, compact, painted in colors that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Japanese called it Shinden, magnificent lightning. But the engineers who built it had another name for it, one they only whispered. They called it the Apology. Not to the enemy, to the pilots who would fly it. Because this machine was designed for men who had already decided to die. The first American pilot to sit in the cockpit was a man named Ray. Captain Raymond Hayes, 26 years old, from a place in Ohio so small it didn't have a traffic light. He'd flown Corsairs in the Pacific, seen friends burn up over the Solomon Islands, watched men ditch into the ocean and never surface. He thought he understood fear. He thought he understood machines. Then they rolled the Shinden out onto the tarmac at Yokosuka Naval Base, and he realized he understood nothing. The engine started with a sound that didn't belong to any aircraft he knew, not the roar of American radials, not the whine of German jets, something deeper, something that seemed to vibrate in his chest before his ears even registered it. The propeller was mounted in the back, pushing rather than pulling, and the wings swept forward like something flying in reverse. It looked wrong, aggressive, hungry. The ground crew, a mix of American mechanics and Japanese engineers who'd surrendered with the prototype, stood at a distance, not the usual distance, farther, like they knew something. Hayes took it up at dawn. The sky over Japan was the color of old bruises, purple and gray, with the sun just starting to burn through the haze. The ascent was smooth, too smooth. The controls felt light, almost non-existent, like the plane was reading his thoughts instead of his hands. He leveled off at 8,000 feet and began the test protocol. Standard turns, 30 degrees, 60 degrees. The plane responded instantly, no lag, no resistance. Then he tried something steeper, 90 degrees, full deflection. And that's when it happened. The world didn't just tilt, it snapped. One moment he was in a banking turn, the next he was facing the opposite direction, his body crushed against the harness, his vision tunneling, his lungs unable to expand. The turn radius was impossible, physically impossible. He'd done the math 1,000 times in training. Turn rate is limited by speed, wing loading, and how much force a human body can withstand. This plane had just ignored all three. It had turned inside its own shadow. When he leveled out, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely key the radio. He didn't report what happened. Not yet. He needed to try again. Needed to be sure he wasn't losing his mind. The second turn was worse. He blacked out for a fraction of a second. When his vision came back, he was in a dive, the altimeter unwinding fast, the ocean rushing up dark and cold. He pulled out at 4,000 feet, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the freezing air. Back on the ground, he sat in the cockpit for 10 minutes before he could unbuckle. The Japanese engineer who designed the flight control system was waiting by the wing. An older man, gray hair, eyes that looked like they'd stopped sleeping years ago. Hayes asked him how it was possible, how the plane could turn like that. The engineer smiled, but there was no joy in it, only exhaustion. He said the plane didn't break the laws of physics. It broke the pilot instead. 3 more American pilots flew the Shinden over the next 2 weeks. All of them reported the same thing. Turns that defied calculation, G-forces that should have killed them but somehow didn't quite. A sensation, described differently by each man but meaning the same thing, that the aircraft was alive, that it wanted something from them.
The debriefings grew longer, more detailed, more desperate. Engineers pored over the design, searching for the secret. Swept forward wings, canard configuration, a propeller placement that eliminated torque in ways they didn't fully understand. But nothing explained the turn rate. Nothing explained why experienced combat pilots came back looking like they'd seen something they couldn't name. Then, on the 16th day of testing, they found the recordings. Hidden in the prototype's manufacturing facility in a locked cabinet that had survived the firebombing. Tapes, dozens of them. Test flights from before the surrender. Japanese pilots pushing the Shinden to its limits. And on one tape, dated April 1945, a pilot's voice, calm, almost serene. He was describing the turn, the impossible turn. He was explaining that the plane had been designed for kamikaze missions, that the extreme maneuverability was meant for one purpose, to ensure that once a pilot committed to a target, no defending fighter could follow, no evasive maneuver could save the ship below. The plane would turn faster than physics allowed because the pilot wouldn't survive to care about the limits. Hayes listened to that recording in a quiet room, through a translator, while rain hammered against the windows. The Japanese pilot's voice never wavered, never showed fear. He described the turn like he was describing a sunset, beautiful and final. And at the end of the tape, just before it cut off, the pilot said something that made the translator pause, made him look up with an expression Hayes would never forget. The pilot said the plane remembered. That night, Hayes couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the engineer's smile, about the tape, about the sensation he'd felt in the cockpit during that second turn. The moment when the world snapped and his body forgot how to work. He'd told himself it was just G-forces, just blood draining from his brain. But now, lying in the dark, listening to the sound of the ocean through his barracks window, he wasn't sure. Because during that fraction of a second that he'd blacked out, he'd seen something, or felt something. A presence, an intention, like the plane had been waiting, like it knew what it was built for, and it was disappointed he'd pulled out of the dive. The testing program was scheduled to continue for another month, but Hayes had a feeling, deep in his gut, where fear lives, that something was about to go very wrong.
The accident happened on a Tuesday. Clear skies, light wind, perfect flying weather. The kind of day where nothing should go wrong. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was the pilot. 23 years old, steady hands, the kind of young man who still believed skill could overcome anything. He'd watched the other pilots fly the Shinden, heard their stories, thought they were exaggerating. He climbed into the cockpit that morning with confidence. That was his first mistake. Hayes watched from the ground, binoculars pressed to his face, a knot of dread already forming in his stomach. He'd tried to warn Webb, tried to explain that the plane was different, wrong in ways that couldn't be measured. But Webb had just smiled. The engine started. That deep, chest-vibrating sound. The Shinden rolled down the runway, lifted off smooth and clean, and climbed into the morning light like it was going home. The first 15 minutes were routine. Webb's voice came through the radio, calm and professional, calling out each step of the test protocol. Hayes could hear the confidence building, could hear Webb starting to relax. That was the second mistake, because the plane had been waiting for the moment when the pilot's guard came down, when he stopped thinking and started feeling, when he let himself believe he was in control. Webb initiated the turn at 12,000 feet, full deflection, maximum bank. Hayes knew the instant it started that something was different. The plane didn't just turn, it whipped, snapped around so fast the contrails from the wingtips braided into a spiral pattern that hung in the air like a scar. Webb's voice cut off mid-word and came back, but it wasn't calm anymore. It was tight, strained, confused. He said he couldn't level out, said the controls weren't responding, said the plane was still turning, tighter, faster, and he couldn't make it stop. Hayes was running before he consciously decided to move, sprinting toward the operations building, screaming for someone to call the crash crews. But his eyes never left the sky, never left the shape of the Shinden as it corkscrewed through the air, descending now, picking up speed, the engine note rising to a scream. Webb's voice on the radio was breaking. He was shouting that the stick was locked, that something was holding it. And then, just for a second, the transmission cleared. And Webb said something that made everyone listening go cold. He said it felt like someone else was flying. The plane came out of the turn at 4,000 feet, wings level, nose pointed directly at the Yokosuka dock facilities, at a freighter being loaded with equipment, at a deck full of men. Webb was screaming now, full panic, saying he was pulling back with everything he had. And Hayes, watching through the binoculars, could see Webb's silhouette thrashing in the cockpit, fighting something, fighting the plane or fighting himself, or fighting the ghost of every Japanese pilot who'd sat in that same seat knowing they'd never land again. 300 feet, 200 feet. Men on the dock started running, 100 feet, 50, and then Webb did the only thing left. The Shinden didn't have an ejection seat. He released the canopy and threw himself out into the air with no parachute, with nothing but the desperate animal instinct to get away from the machine that had stopped being a machine. He hit the water at terminal velocity. The Shinden, 3 of his weight, pulled up at the last possible moment, skimmed over the deck of the freighter close enough to tear an antenna off the mast, climbed back into the sky, and flew. Flew with an empty cockpit, flew in a perfect holding pattern, smooth and controlled, for 17 seconds, then rolled inverted and dove straight into the ocean half a mile offshore. The impact sent up a plume of water that caught the morning light like a monument. They recovered Webb's body that afternoon. The crash investigation started immediately. Navy engineers pulled every piece of the Shinden they could find from the seafloor, analyzed the control systems, the hydraulics, the flight surfaces, looking for mechanical failure, looking for something rational. They found nothing. Every system had been functioning perfectly, right up until the moment Webb threw himself out, right up until the moment the plane flew itself. The Japanese engineer who designed the flight controls was brought in for questioning, the old man with the exhausted eyes. He sat across from a table full of American officers and listened to their theories, their desperate need to make the accident make sense. When they finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked them a question. He asked if any of them had studied the psychological conditioning of kamikaze pilots. What happened to men who were trained not just to accept death, but to love it? He asked what they thought happened to that intention when it was poured into the design of a machine. The officers didn't understand, or didn't want to. They demanded technical answers. But the old man just shook his head. He said the Shinden was built by men who knew they'd lost the war, who knew their country was about to burn, who knew the only thing left was to make their deaths matter. Every calculation, every design choice, all of it infused with the same desperate intention. The plane wasn't just designed to turn impossibly fast, it was designed to never let go, to carry its pilot to the target no matter what, to override hesitation, override fear, override the instinct to survive. And those intentions, he said quietly, don't just disappear because a war ends. Hayes never flew again, not the Shinden, not anything. He put in for a transfer to ground duty the day after Webb's funeral. He wasn't the only one. Every pilot who had flown the prototype asked to be reassigned. The testing program was quietly shut down. The remaining Shinden prototypes were destroyed, burned, melted down, scattered. The official reports listed mechanical failure, pilot error, inconclusive findings, but Hayes knew. They all knew. Some machines are built to kill, and some machines are built with something darker, something that doesn't care if the war is over, doesn't care who's sitting in the cockpit, because it still remembers what it was made to do. Years later, Hayes would wake up in the middle of the night, sheets soaked with sweat, heart hammering, the sound of that engine still vibrating in his chest. He'd dream about the turn, about the moment the world snapped and the plane became something else. And in those dreams, he'd see Webb's face in the canopy, see him thrashing, trying to break free. But behind Webb, shadowed and silent, he'd see other faces. Japanese pilots, young men, all of them staring forward with the same serene expression, the same acceptance, the same terrible love for the machine that killed them. The Shinden, they said, was the most advanced propeller-driven fighter ever built, faster than physics allowed, more maneuverable than human bodies could withstand. A masterpiece of desperate engineering. But Hayes knew the truth. The plane wasn't advanced. It was haunted. Haunted by the intentions of men who'd built it, knowing they'd never see peace. And some hauntings can't be destroyed, can only be buried, hidden, locked away in classified files, and the nightmares of men who survived, men who turned away from the impossible turn, men who landed when the machine wanted them to die, men who spent the rest of their lives wondering if they'd really escaped, or if they were still up there, still turning, still trying to break free, while the engine screamed and the world snapped, and something that remembered war held the controls and refused to let go.